Dungeon Reaper, a light novel by Bloodmoss. Chapter 14. The Skittering Forest. The air inside the dungeon was heavy, damp, and clung to Cain's skin like a second layer. He took a slow, measured breath, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The fog was thin but persistent, curling lazily around the oversized trees that stretched impossibly high. Their bark was blackened, cracked like dry earth, and their twisted branches seemed to reach for the sky in grotesque shapes. The ground beneath his boots was soft, springy with moss, and faintly damp. The light was unsettling. Perpetual twilight cast everything in muted tones, like the world was stuck in the moments just after sunset, lit by a dim, unseen half-moon. Penny shot him a look, her expression telling him that even though they all knew the rundown, it was now his job to detail the situation. Cain didn't need the manual to identify the scenarios anymore. The past month of relentless study and simulations had drilled these details into him. What had once been an overwhelming flood of terms and strategies was now second nature, burned into his mind through sheer repetition. Though this was his first time physically seeing it, his voice came automatically, steady despite the tension knotting in his chest. "This is DRB Scenario 119, the Skittering Forest," he said, his tone clinical. His eyes swept the landscape again, but his mind conjured images he didn't want to see. Children, wandering wide-eyed through this nightmare fairy tale come to life. He cleared his throat, pushing forward. The main features of this dungeon are large spiders, ranging from the size of a house cat to the size of a horse. They live in the trees and attack by ambush. He paused, his stomach twisting. They are all venomous. Some kill quickly, others kill slowly. Some simply paralyze the victim, allowing the spiders to drag them away and eat them alive. The team shifted uncomfortably. Penny crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her jaw set. Felix's usual smirk was absent as his fingers fidgeted nervously against the haft of his weapon. Elise let out a slow breath, her hand twitching toward her longsword. Tara stood still, her fists clenched at her sides. Cain continued, though his throat felt dry. "This is a very well-documented dungeon. At its center point, roughly 2 miles from the entry gate, we will find the Spider Queen." The words felt heavier now. He hesitated, not wanting to say the next part. But he had to. "All adventurer squads are required to do a post-check cleanup of Scenario 119, he said, his voice quieter. "Due to the documented cases of drained and mummified remains of individuals found in cocoons near the Spider Queen's lair." No one said a word, but the implication hung in the air. They all knew this was where they'd find the children. Cain exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to focus. "I advise Felix to scout the area for the perimeter of the dungeon radius. It'll show up as impassable darkness. Once that's located, the center point of the circular area will be in the opposite direction. Elise will take point and use her fire-based skills to clear any webbing we might inadvertently run into. Tara will flank right. I'll flank left. Penny will assist with her inspiration aura and combat as needed." A long pause followed. No one moved at first, each member of the team wrestling with the grim reality of what lay ahead. Tara broke the silence, striding to a nearby tree. She slammed her fist into the rough bark with a force that sent shards flying and branches above rustling ominously. Her voice was low, trembling with rage. "They're only children." Cain didn't reply. He couldn't. The truth was too harsh, too final. Felix adjusted his sadagarami, the weapon resting lightly across his back as he glanced at the group. "I'll scout ahead and find the right path. Give me a few minutes." Without waiting for a reply, he stepped into the misty woods. A faint ripple of shadow curled around his feet, dark tendrils spreading out across the mossy ground and disappearing into the dim light ahead. His form blurred, blending seamlessly into the twilight, until he was little more than a faint silhouette moving silently through the trees. The group watched in tense silence as Felix vanished from sight. Cain felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on his shoulders. The stakes were real now, every second counted. A few minutes later, Felix reappeared as quietly as he had left, stepping from the shadows as if emerging from the forest itself. His voice was low but certain. "Found it." The gate's influence is strongest to the northeast. There's a trail that should get us there, but it's not exactly a straight shot. Elise nodded and stepped forward, her tone steady despite the tension in her features. Good work. I'll take point and clear the way. She drew her long sword, the blade flickering faintly with fire. Let's get moving. The group advanced cautiously, the forest closing in around them with every step. Webbing glistened in the dim light, stretching between the gnarled trees like sinister decorations. The air was thick, damp, and clinging, each breath feeling heavier than the last. Eyes up, Penny called softly, her voice cutting through the uneasy silence. This is where it gets messy. The words had barely left her mouth when a chorus of skittering erupted around them. Shadows moved within the fog, small, quick shapes darting across the webs above and through the underbrush below. Contact! Elise barked, her longsword igniting in a burst of fire as she took point. A spider the size of a large dog lunged toward her from the left, its fanged mandibles clicking hungrily. She stepped into the strike, her blade cleaving through the creature with a sickening crunch. Flames licked across the severed halves, reducing the body to smoldering ash. Felix darted into the shadows, his figure vanishing as he melded with the forest's eerie twilight. Moments later, a spider leapt toward Penny, its spindly legs spread wide, only for Felix to appear behind it. His sadagarami arced in a precise motion, skewering the creature midair and pinning it to the ground. Got your back, boss, he quipped, before slipping into the darkness again. Cain tightened his grip on scythe, its polished steel feeling solid and reassuring in his main hand. In his offhand, dark energy coalesced into the shape of a short sword, shadowy wisps curling around the blade as it took form. He willed it to stay corporeal, ready to fend off attackers with one weapon and strike with the other. A spider lunged at him, mandibles snapping. Cain sidestepped, using the shadowy blade to parry the attack before countering with a vicious slash from scythe. The spider screeched, its legs buckling as it collapsed to the ground. Cain didn't let up, driving the spirit blade into its thorax to finish it off. These things are fast, Tara called out, darting between trees with ease. She vaulted off a low-hanging branch, her twin daggers flashing as she drove them into the eyes of a spider clinging to the bark. With a twist and a kick, she dislodged the corpse and landed gracefully, already scanning for her next target. And too organized. This isn't random. Elise burned through another web, clearing a path to regroup. She's right. They're working together. Cain grunted as another spider lunged at him from above, its fangs glistening with venom. He slashed upward with scythe, severing two of its legs midair. As it hit the ground, he thrust the spirit blade into its abdomen, the dark energy slicing cleanly through its carapace. Watch your six, Penny shouted. Cain spun, raising the spirit blade to block an incoming attack while striking downward with scythe, slicing cleanly through another spider's head. His movements were clumsy at times, his footwork faltered under pressure, but the combination of his blades made up for his lack of finesse. The team tightened their formation, their movements fluid and precise. Felix emerged from the shadows repeatedly, dispatching spiders with surgical efficiency before vanishing again. Elise's fiery blade carved a safe zone, while Tara picked off stragglers and Penny directed their strikes with precision. Despite their teamwork, the group couldn't ignore the eerie intelligence in the spiders' tactics. The creatures flanked, retreated, and attacked with a level of coordination that sent a chill through even the most seasoned of them. After a grueling few minutes, the last spider fell, its charred remains smoldering beneath Elise's blade. The forest went still, the silence almost deafening. Penny took a deep breath, scanning the group. Everyone okay? A series of nods and murmurs confirmed it, though their faces were grim. Cain let the spirit blade dissipate into curling tendrils of mist, his grip on scythe tightening. They were testing us, Felix said finally, his voice low as he cleaned his weapon. And we passed, Penny replied, though her tone carried little relief. She gestured ahead. Let's move before they decide to test us again. The fog grew heavier as the group pressed forward, clinging to their skin and muffling the sound of their footsteps. The webbing around them became denser, forming a lattice that draped over the trees and undergrowth like a suffocating shroud. The faint glimmer of the strands in the dim light made it difficult to tell where the forest ended and the spider's influence began. Felix raised a hand, signaling a stop. He crouched low, his eyes narrowing at a patch of moss just ahead. "Trap," he muttered, pointing to what looked like an innocuous stretch of ground. Cain squinted, barely making out the faint shimmer of webbing that formed a tripwire stretched between two trees. "I don't even want to know what happens if we trigger that." "Then don't," Tara replied, stepping past him with practiced ease. She drew a knife from her belt and carefully severed the tripwire, her movements precise and deliberate. The webbing recoiled slightly, and for a moment, they all held their breath, waiting for some unseen reaction. When nothing happened, she exhaled and stood up. Clear. The group moved cautiously through the increasingly treacherous terrain, their nerves on edge with every step. Felix took the lead, his shadowed form flitting between the trees as he scouted the safest route. Each time he stopped to mark a danger zone or call out a warning, Tara would follow, deftly neutralizing traps with her blades or guiding the others around them. The air itself seemed to grow thicker, almost venomous, as if the forest was alive and conspiring against them. A sharp, metallic tang lingered in the back of Cain's throat, and he found himself breathing through his mouth to avoid the stench. Elise's voice broke the silence, low and strained. "It's getting worse." She gestured to the webbing, which now hung in great sheets, stretching across the path and up into the canopy. Thick, sticky strands hung low, brushing against their shoulders and faces like ghostly fingers. Penny nodded grimly, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "Stay close. Don't let the webs pull you off track." They passed a cluster of cocoons, suspended like grotesque ornaments from the branches above. Cain's stomach churned as he noticed the size of the bundles, smaller than the ones they'd seen earlier. His steps faltered as he realized what that meant. "They're kids," he said quietly, his voice thick. Cain's jaw tightened as he stepped toward one of the cocoons, raising scythe to cut it free. "We can't just leave them like this," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. Penny reached out, gripping his wrist firmly. "Stop," she said, her tone steady but laced with sorrow. "There's nothing we can do for them right now. Even if we found one alive, we can't heal them. And we can't take them with us to where we're going." Cain hesitated, his grip faltering as her words sank in. His shoulders slumped, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "You're right," he muttered, lowering the blade. "I just hate this." "So do we," Penny said softly, her hand lingering for a moment before letting go. "But we keep moving. For them." No one responded, but the weight of the words hung heavy in the air. Tara's jaw tightened, and even Felix, who usually had a quip for every occasion, said nothing. Elise turned away slightly, her knuckles white from a clenched fist. The further they went, the more the remains appeared. Some were shredded, half-empty husks, while others hung eerily still. Cain forced himself to look away, his grip tightening on scythe as he focused on the path ahead. "We're close," Felix said after what felt like an eternity, his voice strained but steady. "The density of the webs means we're nearing the core." Penny looked at the group, her face unreadable. "Let's keep moving. Stay sharp." The forest seemed to close in around them as they pressed on, the oppressive atmosphere sapping their energy and resolve. The only sounds were their controlled breathing and the occasional creak of branches under the weight of webbing. Every step felt heavier, every glance revealing more horrors than they cared to see. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. The path narrowed, forcing the group into a tighter formation. The fog thickened once more, and the webs hanging around them seemed to pulsate faintly, as though alive. The oppressive silence was broken only by the creak of their footsteps and the faint rustling of leaves above. "They're watching us," Felix muttered, his voice barely audible. His sadagarami twitched in his hands, the tension in his posture unmistakable. Before anyone could respond, a shrill screech pierced the air, followed by a thundering crash as a spider nearly the size of a horse barreled out of the shadows. Its carapace glinted with an unnatural, metallic sheen, and its mandibles dripped with venom that hissed as it struck the ground. "Contact!" Penny shouted, raising her dagger. More spiders emerged, these even larger than the scouts they had faced before. Their bodies were thicker, their movements more deliberate. Several reared back, launching globs of webbing toward the group in rapid succession. "Spread out," Elise commanded, her blade igniting as she charged forward. A glob of webbing splattered against a tree to her right, but she didn't slow, her fiery blade slashing through the thick strands like paper. The first spider lunged at her, and she sidestepped, bringing her sword down in a wide arc that cleaved through its armored body with a sickening crunch. Cain took up a position on her flank, switching back to the kuzarigama. He spun the chain experimentally, testing its weight before hurling the weighted ball toward another spider closing in. The ball slammed into its leg joint with a satisfying crack, staggering it long enough for Cain to yank it off balance and lash out with the blade end. His movements were clumsy but effective, the chain keeping the massive creature at bay. Felix melted into the shadows, his form disappearing into the mist. A spider turned, sensing movement, but it didn't see Felix until his sadagarami pierced its side in a precise strike. He used the momentum to vault onto the spider's back, driving the weapon deep into the creature's thorax before leaping off and disappearing again. Penny stayed mobile, darting between skirmishes and calling out commands. "Elise, left flank. Cain, keep them off her. Tara, those web spitters are yours." Tara answered with a sharp nod, her twin daggers flashing as she targeted the spiders lurking further back. She sprinted toward one, evading a glob of sticky webbing with a low roll before driving her blades into its face. Another spider hissed and reared back to spit, but she pivoted smoothly, using the body of her first kill as a shield before dispatching the second with a calculated thrust to its underbelly. The spiders pressed harder, their numbers forcing the group to move as one cohesive unit. Cain swung the chain in wide arcs, forcing the attackers to keep their distance from Elise as her blade carved through their ranks. Felix continued his hit-and-run tactics, exploiting the spiders' blind spots to take them down one by one. One spider managed to pin Penny with a burst of webbing, its venomous mandibles snapping as it closed in. Cain whipped the chain around its body and pulled, the sudden tension causing the spider to collapse onto its side. Penny freed herself with a sharp slash and finished the creature with a well-aimed dagger strike to its exposed underbelly. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with the stench of venom and burned carapace. Finally, the last spider collapsed, its metallic legs twitching before falling still. The group stood in the eerie quiet, their breathing labored. Elise extinguished her blade with a soft hiss, her shoulders heaving. Cain let the kuzarigama dangle loosely from his grip, his arms trembling from exertion. "They're protecting something," Felix said, his voice rough as he wiped blood and ichor from his weapon. "The density of the webs ahead confirms it. We're close." Penny nodded, her expression grim. "Let's finish this." Despite their exhaustion, the team pressed on, their resolve unshaken. The lair was close, and they all knew what awaited them inside.